We need to talk about what just happened in Washington because this one caught a lot of people off guard. And yes, even people who've been watching this circus for years, we're barely into this latest political standoff, and already Susan Collins has managed to do something that's sending shockwaves through conservative circles, and frankly, raising eyebrows on both sides of the aisle. Let me tell you, when Susan Collins is the headline, you know something unusual is going on. Here's the thing, this isn't just another routine vote. This isn't some procedural footnote buried on page 12 of the Senate record. This is a moment that could have real consequences for Trump, for the Republican Party, and for the direction this country is heading next. And I want you to think about that for a moment. How often does one senator's move expose so many fault lines at once? Now, I'll be honest with you. When I first saw the reports coming out, dates, statements, the timing of it all, I had to double check. Because on paper, it didn't make sense. Or at least, it didn't make sense unless you understand the pattern here. You see the pattern here? The public assurances, the carefully worded statements, the concerned tone, and I'm being generous here. We've seen this movie before, haven't we? But here's what really matters. This isn't just about Susan Collins doing what Susan Collins has done for years. It's about how Trump responded. Because while the media was busy framing this as some noble act of independence, Trump was doing something very different behind the scenes and in public. And you know what? That response changes everything. So ask yourself this: why now? Why this moment? Why take this stand when the stakes are this high? And why does it feel like the press is desperately hoping you won't ask those questions? We're going to walk through exactly what happened, why it matters, and why Trump's reaction is not what the establishment was expecting. Stick with me, because once you see the full picture, you won't unsee it. Before we go any further into what just happened inside the Capitol and why it matters, make sure you're subscribed here so you don't miss the full breakdown as this story unfolds. But before we get into what Susan Collins just did, let me remind you what we were told. Because context matters here, let me remind you what Republican voters were promised explicitly over and over again. We were told that when it counted, Republicans would stand firm. We were told that after years of chaos, sabotage, and endless investigations, the party had finally learned its lesson. And we were told, by Susan Collins herself on multiple occasions, that she understood the stakes. Let's be clear about that. In October 2020, Collins told the Portland Press-Herald that she had a good working relationship with Donald Trump and that she believed in fairness and due process. In 2022, she went on CBS Face the Nation and said she opposed partisan overreach and warned against weaponizing institutions. Those are her words, not mine. This isn't my opinion. These are the facts. Now fast forward to today, we're years into Trump fighting back against what is very clearly a coordinated political effort to sideline him permanently. And what do we see? Collins breaking ranks at a moment when unity actually matters. We see carefully timed statements expressing concern. We see votes and procedural moves that, conveniently, line up with Democratic narratives. And we see the media celebrating her as courageous all over again. Think about that for a moment. Let me say that again because I want you to really hear it. The same media that spent years calling Republicans a threat to democracy is now applauding a Republican for undercutting her own party's most popular figure. You see the pattern here? And here's the thing, this is what this is really about. It's not about Susan Collins' conscience. It's not about principle. It's about the permanent political class, the establishment Republicans and Democrats who cannot stand the idea of Trump refusing to go quietly. That's the real enemy here, not disagreement, not debate, but a system that protects itself at all costs. And here's the kicker. This is bigger than Susan Collins, bigger than one vote, bigger than one fight. This is about whether voters actually get to choose their leaders or whether a small group of elites gets to overrule them when the outcome makes them uncomfortable. Let's start with who Susan Collins is, because if you're only getting your news from CNN or MSNBC, you probably think she's some kind of fearless maverick who bravely stands up to her own party on principle. That's the cartoon version. But here's the truth. Susan Collins has been a U.S. Senator from Maine since 1997. That's over 27 years in Washington. She's won re-election 5 times, often by branding herself as a moderate Republican who values compromise above all else. That reputation didn't happen by accident. Let me tell you about her record. Collins has served on powerful committees, appropriations, intelligence, armed services. She's not some backbencher. She knows exactly how the Senate works. Over the years, she's built a brand around being concerned, around taking time to study the issue, around releasing long statements that sound serious but somehow always seem to land at the most politically convenient moment. She once famously said she was leaning toward supporting certain controversial measures, only to reverse herself later. You've seen this pattern before. Now let's talk about how we got here. During the Trump presidency, Collins publicly supported him on some key votes, especially early on. In 2016 and 2017, she voted with Trump over 60% of the time, according to Senate trackers. But as the media pressure ramped up, impeachment, investigations, nonstop coverage, something changed. She began issuing statements emphasizing her independence. In 2019, she said the Senate needed to be an impartial body, a phrase the media absolutely loved. They quoted it endlessly. And here's the media part you're not supposed to notice. Every time Collins broke with Trump, headlines praised her courage. Every time she sided with him, coverage was muted or buried. If you're only getting your news from the mainstream press, you'd think she was the last reasonable Republican left in a party gone mad. That's not an accident. That's framing. Now layer Trump back into this. After leaving office, Trump didn't disappear. He stayed front and center. He raised hundreds of millions of dollars. He held rallies pulling in tens of thousands of people, and he made it very clear he wasn't done fighting. That terrified the establishment on both sides, because this was never supposed to happen. So you've got Susan Collins, a career senator with a carefully cultivated image, and you've got Trump refusing to play by the old rules. The establishment thought this story was over. They thought the base would move on. But that's not what happened. And here's where it gets interesting. Because when the pressure came back, recently, Collins had a choice. And the choice she made tells you everything about what comes next. Hit that like button if you're following along so far and seeing exactly where this story is heading. Let's talk about Susan Collins' recent actions around Trump, because this is where things stop being abstract and start getting very concrete. And I want to be fair here. Serving in the Senate isn't easy. There's pressure from donors, from party leadership, from activists back home, and from a media environment that is relentlessly hostile to anyone even loosely associated with Trump. We all understand that. Politics is messy. Governing is complicated. But here's the reality. When it mattered most, Susan Collins didn't just distance herself. She actively sided with a narrative designed to cripple Trump politically. Let's walk through the evidence. Example number 1, January 2021, the second impeachment of Donald Trump. Collins didn't just vote to convict, she publicly justified it by saying Trump had learned a lesson. That was her phrase. She told reporters that the president had been impeached twice, and that was sufficient accountability. Think about that for a moment. A U.S. senator arguing that impeachment itself, regardless of outcome, was the goal. Not justice, not due process, but symbolism. Example number 2. In February 2021, Collins went on record supporting censure and ongoing investigations, even after Trump had already left office. The constitutional questions were obvious. Legal scholars across the spectrum raised concerns, but Collins brushed that aside, saying the process was important for the country. Important for whom, exactly? Example number 3, and this one's big. In 2023 and 2024, as Trump began openly fighting back, Collins repeatedly signaled openness to legislation and procedural moves that aligned with Democratic efforts to limit Trump's influence. She framed it as protecting institutions. The media ate it up. Headlines praised her integrity, once again. And here's the kicker. The same Susan Collins who claimed impeachment would send a message later admitted quietly that Trump's support among Republican voters hadn't declined. In fact, polling showed Trump leading primary rivals by 30 to 40 points nationally. Let me say that again. She helped justify extraordinary actions, knowing full well they didn't achieve the stated goal. So, what does this mean? It means this was never about calming the country. It was about appeasing the establishment and the press. This is the problem with performative moderation. It sounds reasonable, it looks responsible, but in practice it empowers the very forces that voters are rebelling against. And you know what? Trump noticed, and he didn't stay quiet. Speaking of Trump noticing, let's talk about how Susan Collins' actions line up with the broader institutional response, and why this angle matters even more than the votes themselves. Because while Section 4 was about formal decisions, this is about coordination, incentives, and timing. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Here's the new angle: messaging and alignment. Not just what Collins voted for, but when she spoke, how she framed it, and who immediately benefited. Take March 2024. As Trump was consolidating support, polling showed him leading the Republican field by roughly 35 points. Collins released a statement warning about norms and institutional stability. No new legislation, no new facts, just rhetoric. And within hours, that statement was amplified by the New York Times, CNN, and Politico. That's not coincidence, that's choreography. Example 2. During a Sunday talk show appearance, Collins echoed language nearly identical to Democratic talking points, emphasizing that no one is above the law. Now, that sounds fine on the surface, but here's the problem. That phrase was being used very deliberately to justify selective prosecutions. Legal analysts like Alan Dershowitz and even former federal prosecutors pointed out the uneven application, yet Collins never addressed that imbalance. Silence. Example 3. Donor behavior. After Collins' public breaks with Trump, her campaign received notable support from centrist PACs and corporate donors who had previously avoided Trump-aligned Republicans. We're talking about millions of dollars over multiple cycles. That's like a referee suddenly getting paid by one team and insisting the calls are still neutral. Think about that for a moment. But here's what they can't explain away. If this was really about principle, then why does it always break one direction? If it was about protecting democracy, then why ignore government overreach, censorship, and selective enforcement? Because if their claim were true, if Trump were uniquely dangerous, then consistent standards would apply across the board, right? But they don't, and that tells you everything you need to know. This isn't random. This is part of a broader pattern where so-called moderates act as the pressure release valve for the system. They give the establishment cover. They make radical actions seem reasonable. And that's the problem conservatives have been warning about for years. Government doesn't fail loudly at first. It fails politely. It fails with carefully worded statements and bipartisan applause. And here's why this matters more than surface-level drama. This is about whether power answers to voters or whether it insulates itself using friendly faces. You see the pattern here? Because once you do, Trump fighting back doesn't look reckless. It looks necessary. Drop a comment right now if you saw this coming or if you've got thoughts on it. I read every single one. Now I want to talk about something that really exposes what's going on here, because this is the part that doesn't just frustrate conservatives, it should bother anyone who still believes words are supposed to mean something in politics. Susan Collins has spent years telling voters she believes in due process. That's not a talking point I'm putting on her. That's her own language. In 2018, during the Kavanaugh hearings, Collins gave a lengthy floor speech warning against presumption of guilt and said, quote, "Fairness and due process are not partisan principles." That's a direct quote. She framed herself as a defender of constitutional norms. But then look at what she actually did when Trump was the target. She said she opposed rushed judgments. Then she supported impeachment based on evidence that was still being contested. She said institutions should not be weaponized for political purposes. Then she backed investigations that continued long after Trump left office, even as legal experts questioned their constitutional basis. Said X, did Y over and over again. Think about that for a moment. The same senator who warned against emotional, politically charged processes suddenly decided those exact processes were acceptable, so long as they were aimed at Trump. Let that sink in. And when this contradiction was pointed out, what did Collins do? Did she pause? Did she reassess? Did she acknowledge the inconsistency? No. She doubled down. She told reporters that this situation is different, without ever clearly explaining why. Different how? Different because of the facts, or different because of the person involved. This is what selective principle looks like. This is what establishment ideology looks like in practice. It's not that the rules disappear, it's that they only apply to certain people. And here's the most telling detail of all. When Democrats ignored due process in other contexts, Collins was silent. When Trump was involved, suddenly urgency appeared. That tells you everything you need to know about priorities. This isn't about protecting norms, it's about protecting the system from disruption. And Trump, whether you like him or not, represents disruption. And you know what? Voters see this. They may not follow every procedural vote, but they understand fairness. And once they sense hypocrisy, trust collapses fast. That's why this moment matters more than any single statement or vote. Let me shift gears for a minute and talk about consequences, because politics isn't just a game of statements and Senate floor speeches. There are real-world effects when leaders choose symbolism over substance. And this is where Susan Collins' choices intersect directly with the lives of actual people, not pundits, not donors, not cable news panels, but voters. Here's the consequence angle. By legitimizing the idea that Trump can be sidelined through institutional pressure rather than elections, Collins and others like her helped accelerate a collapse of trust. And that collapse has a cost. Republican voters didn't suddenly become more moderate. They became more cynical. According to Gallup, trust in Congress among Republicans dropped below 10% in recent years. That's not an accident. That's the result of watching promised standards evaporate. Look at turnout patterns. In several special elections and primaries, tens of thousands of Republican voters simply stayed home. Local party officials have admitted this openly. Why? Because they don't believe the system listens anymore. Think about the human impact of that. When voters disengage, activists and elites gain power. Regular people lose their voice. Now, Collins will tell you, and her defenders will tell you, that her actions were about cooling tensions and protecting democracy. And I'm sure that's technically true in the abstract. Those words sound responsible. But here's what's also true. Tensions didn't cool. They escalated. Faith in institutions didn't recover. It eroded further, and the political divide widened. And you know what? Trump didn't disappear. Despite everything, impeachments, investigations, wall-to-wall negative coverage, his support hardened. In some demographics, it actually grew. That's the opposite of the stated goal. This is what happens when experience is replaced by ideology, when leaders assume voters can be managed instead of persuaded. Now, some people might say, well, that's not Susan Collins' responsibility. She can't control how voters react. Fair enough. But she is responsible for her choices, and those choices sent a clear signal. Outcomes matter less than appearances. Process matters only when it serves the system. The people paying the price for that are everyday voters who want stability, fairness, and a government that works. Instead, they got more chaos, just dressed up in nicer language. And that brings us to the critics, because they have a response to all of this, and we need to address it head on. Now let me address something that some people might be thinking, because I want to be fair here. You might hear critics say, Susan Collins is just doing her job. She's following the Constitution. She's not supposed to be loyal to Trump. She's supposed to be loyal to the country. And look, on one level, yes, senators are not cheerleaders. They're not supposed to rubber stamp any one individual. That part is absolutely true. Am I saying Susan Collins should agree with Trump on everything? No. Am I saying dissent is automatically betrayal? Of course not. Disagreement is healthy in a functioning system. I'll say that plainly. But here's the problem. What we're talking about here is not good faith disagreement. It's selective application of principles. It's consistency, or the lack of it. Because if your standard is protect institutions, then that standard has to apply all the time, not just when the political winds are blowing one direction, and that's where this falls apart. Think about it. When institutions expand their power, when agencies overreach, when free speech gets throttled through informal pressure, Where was the urgency then? Where were the long statements? Where was the media praise? Suddenly, caution disappears. Silence sets in. And you know what? That kind of asymmetry should concern everyone, regardless of party, because once you normalize using institutions to sideline political opponents, you don't get to choose who that power is used against next. History is very clear about that. Some people might also say, well, Trump brings this on himself. And again, on one level, yes, Trump is unconventional, confrontational, and disruptive. No one disputes that. But disruption is not a crime. Popularity is not a threat, and refusing to conform is not grounds for institutional punishment. So when critics frame this as courage, what they're really praising is compliance with the system, not with voters. And that's why this debate isn't about personality. It's about power. And that brings us to the bigger lesson here. But you know what worries me most? It's not just the hypocrisy. Hypocrisy, at least, can be exposed. It can be called out. It can be corrected. What worries me most is the worldview underneath all of this, the ideology that says outcomes matter more than process, and that power should be managed by responsible people rather than entrusted to voters. The fundamental problem is this: when elites decide that certain political outcomes are unacceptable, democracy becomes conditional. And history tells us exactly where that road leads. It's been tried dozens of times. In the Soviet Union, elections existed on paper, but real power was insulated from public pressure. In Venezuela, leaders claimed they were protecting democracy while systematically hollowing it out. Different cultures, different rhetoric, same result. Centralized power, crushed dissent, economic and civic decay. Now, I'm not saying the United States is the Soviet Union. Let me be very clear about that. But the logic is the same. The characteristics are familiar: moral certainty, selective enforcement, institutional arrogance. Add to that an obsession with control, a distrust of ordinary citizens, and a belief that experts know better than voters, and you have a recipe that never ends well. This isn't just about Susan Collins. This isn't just about Trump. This is about whether experience and consent still matter more than ideology and image. Conservatives have always warned that government incompetence grows fastest when accountability disappears, when private property rights are treated as negotiable, when free speech is managed, when political opposition is viewed as a threat instead of a feature. And you know what? We're watching it happen in real time. Not through tanks in the streets, but through polite statements, procedural maneuvers, and bipartisan applause. That's how modern institutional decay works, quietly, respectably, with all the right words. This is why Trump's refusal to step aside matters, whether you like his style or not. It challenges the idea that the system gets to choose its challengers. And once that idea takes hold, elections become theater. The broader lesson here is simple and timeless. Power must fear the people more than the people fear power. Once that balance flips, no amount of moderation can save you. And that's the real warning embedded in this entire episode. So where does this leave us? Weeks into the aftermath of Susan Collins' latest move, what have we learned? We've learned that loyalty to principle is often conditional, depending on who the target is. We've learned that the establishment will always protect itself first, regardless of public outrage or voter opinion. We've learned that selective enforcement of norms corrodes trust faster than outright incompetence. We've learned that real disruption, the kind that challenges entrenched power, is treated as a threat rather than a feature of democracy. And finally, we've learned that words mean very little without consistent action to back them up. And here's what I want to say to the people who feel frustrated, confused, or even betrayed by all of this. I understand why you did what you did. I really do. You were tired of broken promises. You were fed up with partisan games. You wanted accountability, fairness, and leaders who actually follow through. But here's the thing, and I say this with respect: relying on elites to enforce your version of justice isn't the answer. The answer is to engage, to challenge, and to insist that the system works for voters, not just for insiders. That's how you preserve liberty. That's how you keep power accountable. And that's how you make sure the cycle doesn't repeat itself endlessly. But that's not what the current establishment, or Collins in this instance, is offering. They're offering a comforting narrative, one that promises fairness if only the right people are targeted, and that if we just trust them, everything will sort itself out. History tells us how that story ends. It ends with cynicism, disengagement, and growing frustration among ordinary Americans. So, mark my words, this is a moment that matters, a moment that exposes cracks, hypocrisy, and real stakes for the future of governance. And if we ignore it, if we sit back and accept it, the cycle will. Pause for a second and hit that like button if you're finding real value in this coverage.